Nothing prepares you for F-Zero, created for the new Super Nintendo Entertainment System. You won't believe the power. You won't believe the control. You won't believe the jumps, the curves, or the feeling you get until you experience it for yourself.
Wow, that's fast.
F-Zero for the ultimate G-Force, only on the next generation from Nintendo. Now you're racing with power, superpower.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Super Nintendo review here on Player One Start. In the last video, we were taking a look at the launch of the Super Nintendo here in North America, as well as the pack-in title Super Mario World. And in this video, we're going to continue taking a look at the launch titles. One thing that kind of amazed me about the launch lineup of the Super Nintendo is just how many games there were. I actually thought the two launch titles in Japan were the same two launch titles here in North America. I was actually surprised when doing research to figure out, oh, they had more games that released with it, and which games they were. As previously shown, there were only two titles that launched with the system when the Super Famicom came out in Japan: Super Mario World and F-Zero. Before the end of the year, though, they would expand the lineup a little bit, but they didn't have a lot of time because they released so close to the holiday season. There weren't that many games that launched in the US either, but compared to the Japanese launch, it was over double the amount of games available at launch in Japan. And although there weren't that many games at launch, they would have a lot more time before the end of the year to round out the game library to include a lot more genres. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's just go ahead and start taking a look at the launch lineup, starting with F-Zero was also available at launch, and this game was unique in the fact that it was seen as the first game that offered a fast-paced 3D racing environment on a home system. In 1991, most things that were 3D on home systems and even computers at the time either had to sacrifice frame rate or detail in order to get it to work on such limited hardware. Anything that would run in high detail at a fast frame rate was reserved to the arcades at this time. So when F-Zero hit the scene with its fast-paced, highly detailed racing tracks and colorful environments, as well as that amazing score, one might be able to get a hint of what it was like to play this title for the first time. The game itself is a futuristic racing game where players compete in high-speed racing tournaments called F-Zero. There are 4 characters in the game that have their own selectable hover car, along with each having a unique performance ability. The goal of this game is the same as any racing game: cross the finish line before most of your opponents, and you will continue. A gameplay element that adds to the strategy of your racing game is that every time you come into contact with an obstacle, such as the barrier of the track, you will lose a bit of your power. Somewhere near the starting line is a zone that will restore your power, which I consider like pitting, but only while you're traveling through the zone. If you run out of power before you can replenish it, your car will explode and the race ends. Every time you complete a lap, you earn a 4-second speed boost called the Super Jet. You're also awarded points based on your position when you cross the finish line. If you get a certain number of points, you can earn a spare machine that will allow you another chance to retry the course. There are a total of 15 tracks divided into 3 leagues, each ordered by difficulty. And really from there, it's up to you to win each race and unlock the rest of the areas. As you may be able to tell from when we cover the graphics of the Super Nintendo, this game heavily relies on the new Mode 7 scaling and rotation of background layers. In fact, this game, along with another US launch title we'll cover here in a little bit, were developed almost entirely for the sake of showing the system's pseudo-3D capabilities of Mode 7. This game was very well received by game critics and gamers for its graphical realism of the time. Almost every game review of the time, including Jeremy Parrish of Electronic Gaming Monthly, wrote in his review that the game's use of Mode 7 created, quote, the most convincing racetracks that had ever been seen on a home console. The game was also praised for its variety of tracks and steady increase in difficulty. The game has scored usually consistently in the upper 80s and lower 90s, however upon re-releases it has been received less positively, due to the fact that we're more used to seeing Mode 7, and the fact that Mode 7 just doesn't look as good on a modern display as it does on an old CRT display. In the later 90s, this game was constantly ranked on the top 100 best console games of all time. However, as we've approached the 2000s and beyond, it has gone further down the list. This game is known today as setting the standard for the racing genre on home video game consoles, and for kicking off a game franchise that has been dormant for what I believe to be far too long. As for games on this system, this is still one of the best racing games on this system, and I credit that to this game's design and its arcade-style feel and controls. It's easy to pick up, but difficult to master. Anyone who's a casual player should be able to get in and complete a few races, but the only criticism I have of this game, or at least the main one, is the fact that it is only single player. But don't worry, there will be another game developed for this system specifically to address that criticism. Overall though, I can remember going through this game and trying to beat my brother's high scores when we would rent it, and this is one of the first games I was surprised to see working at full speed when I started emulating games in the later 90s. Even though the Mode 7 produces some graphical artifacts we're not used to seeing in video games anymore, I think that its art style holds up well today, and I still feel this is an essential for a collection of the Super Nintendo. Pilotwings is a video game developed and published by Nintendo for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. It was originally released in Japan in December of 1990, shortly after the launch of the Super Famicom. Perhaps due to its extended use of Mode 7 graphics, it was also included as a launch title for the Super Nintendo in August of 1991 in North America. The game itself is designed to be an amateur flight simulator game in which the player attempts to earn pilot licenses through lessons in plane flight, hang gliding, skydiving, and even the use of a rocket pack. As you progress through the game, you'll unlock each mode, and you can also go through bonus stages and levels that involve an attack helicopter. Each style of flight offers unique controls and gameplay mechanics, and although some may find these controls a bit complicated at first, the game does a great job of making you go through each flight mode and learning how to go through it before you actually go through the rest of the game. Each training area can be replayed if necessary, and passwords allow the players to save their progress. In the light plane mode, the player must follow a path of orbs, or fly through rings of orbs, and then land on a runway. Which, as you can tell from my gameplay here, I'm a bit out of practice. In skydiving, the player jumps from a helicopter at a high altitude and maneuvers leaning back and forth and rotating around horizontally, also having to fall through rings of orbs in the sky before deploying their parachute and then attempting to land in their target area. There's also a little bonus platform where more experienced players can try to land, but if you miss, you'll most likely end up in the water, and then you'll be considered out of bounds and fail the test. Surprisingly, considering my performance on the light plane mode, I was able to get this in one shot. The Rocket Belt mode I find kinda similar, only now you're given the ability to control where you're at in the air by using the thrust of your jetpack. In this mode, you have to maneuver around, learning how to conserve your fuel, not using too much so you don't run out, all while flying through rings before gently landing yourself on the landing platform. This one did take me a few tries to get right, but once I got used to the controls, it wasn't too bad, but it wasn't one of my favorite modes in the whole game. In hang gliding, your goal is to catch thermal currents, represented by ascending white dots, until you reach a specified altitude. Then you have to land as close as possible to your target landing area, and failure in any of these modes means you have to repeat them before you're able to move on. After completing all 4 training missions, the player is informed that an agent has infiltrated an enemy base, and that they have kidnapped the player's instructors. The player's mission is to fly an attack helicopter from an offshore aircraft carrier and retrieve the captives by landing on a helipad on the island. The rescue mission stands out from the rest of the game in the fact that the player does more than just maneuver an aircraft, as they must fly over the island and successfully dodge anti-aircraft fire. Pilotwings was again positively received by gamers and critics alike upon its launch, and in retrospective reviews it is fondly remembered, however, again, not as much so as when it came out. My main criticism of this game is that at the time, if I had purchased this game, I don't think I would have got my money's worth out of it, as the game is incredibly short, and once the novelty wears off, it becomes kind of boring, and not a game I like to come back to. However, I am willing to concede that if I had played this game as a kid, I would probably have much more of a nostalgic-fueled fondness for this game, but as I didn't grow up with this game, and I didn't really even hear about it until the early 2000s, by that time it wasn't something that I would have been very impressed by. So while I couldn't recommend this game as essential, if you really want to see one of the tech demos of what Mode 7 was designed to do on the Super Nintendo, this game is worth a pickup, mainly because it's still not very expensive, at least as of the making of this video, as it sold decently well enough to have a franchise spin-off from it. One of the things I find the most strange about Gradius III is that this game was not a launch title for the Japanese console, and usually side-scrolling shooters would be more popular over there than they would be in the United States. And that is partially evidenced by the fact that the arcade version of this game didn't even make it over to the US anywhere near where this game launched. In fact, I believe the first instance of the arcade game being playable here in the United States was in the Gradius collection for the PlayStation 2. But getting back to Gradius III on the Super Nintendo, in this game, you pilot a Vic Viper starfighter in order to battle the onslaughts of the Bacterian Empire. Those of you that have played Gradius and Salamander before it may be familiar with how this game is set up, as this game contains the familiar weapons, level layouts, and enemies that became trademarks of this series. This version for the Super Nintendo in North America had an option of reduced difficulty and additional armaments for the Vic Viper. Unlike in the arcades, this version is the only one that allows players to continue when they have lost all their lives. A harder difficulty called Arcade can be unlocked by inputting a code, which is quickly tapping the A button 16 times within a second on the option screen. However, although this mode is harder, it is not the same as the arcade version as other people have reported to me. Overall, this is a fairly standard shooter, and I have played the original version on the NES, unfortunately not the arcade version. I do like the options you get at the very beginning where you can select what type of configuration you want your ship to be before you start playing, but other than that, it's just see how far you can get before you die and then keep playing so you can get better at the game. As I've stated before, I was not initially a fan of side-scrolling shooters for this reason, with a notable exception or two, and I find that Gradius is a great addition to the collection, but one of the things you're going to run into that a lot of people have noted with this game is the slowdown. Whenever there's a lot of action on screen, and sometimes in areas that I think really shouldn't have it, the game will slow down to a crawl, and I'm not quite sure if this makes it easier or not, but it does make me a bit more frustrated with the game as I play through it. This is not the only game to suffer from this issue, especially being a scrolling shooter, but it's just something I will note as something that may hamper your gameplay a bit, as it is an ever-present issue. I've seen other gamers review this game at about a 7.5 to 8 out of 10, and I would say it ranks more towards the 8 out of 10 for me. It is definitely a competent launch title that adds some much-needed variety for other game players on here, and I've seen it ranked in some of the best Super Nintendo games of all time in more modern retrospectives. In terms of recommending it to collectors though, or casual players, I'm not sure this game is going to be good for everybody because it does have such a high difficulty rate, and this style of gameplay has kind of gone by the wayside in more modern times. But for me, I do have a bit of nostalgia for these types of titles, as it does remind me of the system that essentially introduced me to the concept of a side-scrolling shooter, and even though I wasn't initially a big fan, the genre's kind of grown on me. So if you want to give it a try, this one is good, but there are other games on here that I would recommend first. Last but not least is an iconic game that I think is usually more associated with the PC, and that is SimCity. In retrospect, it may not appear to make much sense why Nintendo would go through leaps and bounds of porting the game themselves to the Super Nintendo when this game was mainly designed to be used on a PC, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, how the game port to me isn't really the preferred way I'd like to play this. But thinking back to 1991, the majority of Americans still did not own a home personal computer. And for a system that could run SimCity in full color, that would be a pricey proposition at that. But if you bought a Super Nintendo for $199 and the game cartridge for an additional $50, getting this game for that price point would have been much more cost effective than buying a PC simply just to play this game. And diving into the gameplay, it is very similar to the PC version, except now there are more buildings and scenarios available to the player. Another feature added into this version is a character called Dr. Wright, who is considered to be a parody of the creator of the SimCity series, Will Wright, who will give you game tips as you play the game. And as Nintendo did the porting of this game themselves, there will also be some hidden Easter eggs in there, such as Bowser who will attack, who replaces Godzilla in the PC version, and the player can also unlock a Mario statue. Other than that, you have to zone your areas, grow your city, create an infrastructure, provide human services, and everything you would expect to do in a SimCity game. The only big problem I have with this game is I really wish that I would be playing it with a proper mouse. And sadly, the Super Nintendo mouse, since it came out after this game, is not compatible with this game. That means you have to wait until your cursor gets dragged over to the point of the screen where you want to click on, and that to me becomes a huge inconvenience throughout this entire game. However, if you're willing to overlook that, this game is almost as fun as the original SimCity, and I would recommend it to those that do like this kind of game, although strategy games I don't think appeal to everybody, so I wouldn't recommend it to everyone. But for those that do play this game, you will definitely see that Nintendo took a lot of time and care in porting this game to their system. Out of all the launch games though, I think the ones I played the most were F-Zero and Super Mario World. Super Mario World is that game that I played very first, December 25th, 1991. In fact, there's a story about why I didn't do it on the day we got the Super Nintendo, linked in the description below. But anyway, it was a small launch lineup, but it had two really good games to make it feel like it wasn't really that small. Overall, though, I do believe that the SNES launch lineup was a bit bare bones, especially considering the amount of time they had to port more games over to this system from Japan. Thankfully, though, the launch lineup would be quickly expanded in the following months in 1991, and in the next video we're going to start going through all the games that released near the system's launch before the end of the system's launch year. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.